My name is Tim and this is a presentation on protectionism and assimilation, government policy and education in ATSI communities. We start with the founding documents of the nation and the early legislation, and we see that relations did not get off to a good start. Section 127 of the Australian Constitution, since repealed, originally said as follows, quote, "In reckoning the numbers of the people of the Commonwealth, or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted," end quote. So we see that Indigenous people were excluded from the census and so could not participate in federal elections. This exclusion at the federal level naturally led to the issue of interaction between governments and, as they viewed them, this subset of the population. The federal exclusion passed the issue on to the states. New South Wales responded by passing the Aborigines Protection Act 1909, which established the Board of Protection for Aborigines. We'll take a brief look here at the powers of the board. Section 7 of the Aborigines Protection Act, the text of which is on the handout, I think, read as follows. "It shall be the duty of the board, A, to, with the consent of the minister, apportion, distribute, and apply as may seem most fitting any monies voted by Parliament and any other funds in its possession or control for the relief of Aborigines. B, to distribute blankets, clothing and relief to Aborigines at the discretion of the board. C, to provide for the custody, maintenance and education of the children of Aborigines," we'll get to that. D, to manage regular use of reserves, and E, a useful catch-all at the end, to exercise a general supervision and care over all matters affecting the interests and welfare of Aborigines and to protect them against injustice, imposition and fraud. As a brief side comment, the irony of a piece of legislation called the Aborigines Protection Act, talking about protecting them against injustice, imposition and fraud, is palpable. So, some analysis of the law here. There is an underlying assumption that the Indigenous population somehow needed these protections on offer in the legislation. The implication is that they could not take care of themselves, and that Europeans were somehow, this is a version of the white man's burden, essentially to civilise the Indigenous population precisely as a parent would a child. In 1983, in the Coe v. Gordon decision, Justice Lee noted that the protection afforded by the Aborigines Protection Act was in its nature paternalistic, rather than being about the granting of enforceable legal rights. They were being treated like children, effectively. I agree, Judge. So let's look at some individual subsections of the law here. We are distributing blankets, clothing and relief to Aborigines at the discretion of the board. All European comforts, it should be noted. But perhaps the most egregious subsection of all is the infamous subsection C, which provides for the custody, maintenance and education of the children of Aborigines. Read, "they could be removed." This, along with section 11 of the legislation, was the basis for the later stolen generations, one of the most horrific aspects of Australian history. Now, the law, as if this law did not go far enough by allowing for the removal of Indigenous children, in 1915 the law would go further, which removed the necessary element of neglect as the basis for the removal and allowed for removal on the far more vague and noxious grounds of threats to the moral welfare of the children. This was almost, I would suggest, intentionally vague in order to allow for such removal. As C.S. Lewis said, "No tyranny is so oppressive as one genuinely practiced for the good of the oppressed, since such tyrants tend to act with the approval of their own consciences." And tyranny certainly was the word. So we've looked at the laws for protectionism. Now let's have a brief listen to the people who were there, those who actually lived through it. On the handout is an extract from the Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs hearing on stolen Aboriginal wages from 2006. So let's read over this real quick and then I want to do some analysis. Everything that related to a concentration camp was there in Cherbourg. You could not move without getting a permit. Cherbourg is built right on Bramble Creek. About 100 metres or so away from the river was the farmer's house. We had to get a permit to go down and fish there. We had to get a permit to go to Mergen, which was 4 miles away. And even that had a time set on it. If you came back 5 to 10 minutes after that time expired, you would be put in jail for maybe a weekend. And they brought the curfew in. All lights had to be out at 9 o'clock. If you were found out after dark or after the lights had gone out, you were put in jail. They even put searchlights on the vehicles, the police, the superintendent, and chased blackfellas everywhere, hither and thither throughout the night hours. During the mid-40s, they took away our corroborees, they took away our culture. Our ancestors were not allowed to teach us our native language. Most of us know nothing of our language. End quote. So we have permits to move, permits to fish, curfews, searchlights. Concentration camps, indeed. In fact, I would go so far as to say they were prisoners in their own country. The impact of this on individuals should not be downplayed. Restrictions on personal freedom and movement, bureaucracy as a means of control, threats of jail, which is essentially terror tactics if they step out of line. However, I would suggest that the greatest impact of this was cultural and linguistic. Language and culture survive through transmission and use. If they do not get used, they do not get transmitted, and so they die. I would suggest, as blunt as this term is, we are dealing here with cultural and linguistic genocide. We move now to another aspect of interaction between Indigenous populations and Europeans: missions. Missions are, of course, activities carried out by Christians to convert Indigenous populations, and anyone else, in fact, to Christianity, and, at least in this context, to civilize these people. And, by the way, lest we think that this is somehow a purely historical occurrence, recall the recent example of those missionaries who went into a remote community, converted some of the members, and convinced them that their traditional practices were devil worship, which resulted in several sacred artifacts being burned. So little has changed. The dual effect of missions was noted as early as the 70s by Rowley when he said that, and this quote's on the handout, when he said of missions that they must certainly be credited with the survival of Aboriginal populations, but this kind of control, especially where the missionary was insensitive to the imperatives of Aboriginal culture and driven hard by conscience to save souls, was almost as destructive of Aboriginal autonomy as seizure and use of the land or use of the group as a source of labour on the cattle station. End quote. Now, a brief comment on this desire to civilise. That is clearly grounded in Europeans' sense of cultural superiority and imperialist arrogance. Now, we focused to this point on New South Wales. That's because, as we said, the issue was very much in the hands of the states. The campaign for full citizenship, however, began to encompass the involvement of the federal government. This campaign culminated, of course, in the 1967 referendum, which repealed Section 127 of the Constitution, and it also achieved the transfer of responsibility from the states to the federal government of the crafting of laws concerning Indigenous people. Now, rather than issuing, or ushering in, I should say, a new era of racial harmony, this led to a political battle, if you can believe it, between the state and federal and territory governments over usually costs and assigning blame for the fact that various policies had failed. Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives. So up to this point, we've dealt with the history of interaction between the various European governments in Australia and the Indigenous population. But what does this mean for education? So in broad summary, and I encourage you to consult Reynolds 2001 for a much more detailed analysis, but in broad summary, attitudes to Indigenous education mirrored the approach to interactions generally, protectionism and assimilation as time went on. Now, I'm going to look briefly, got some definitions of the terms protectionism and assimilation here. This is on the handout as well. So protectionism refers to the early relations between Europeans and Indigenous people, where Indigenous Australians were thought to need protection, which is better understood as needing to be controlled by white society. This practice was enshrined into law and remained the case for decades, with severe social, economic and psychological consequences. Assimilation. This is the idea that Indigenous Australians needed to be made or remade into Europeans, leaving their traditional culture behind and adapting to European civilization. Naturally, this showed tremendous cultural insensitivity and was, let us be blunt, grounded in racism and a European sense of cultural and civilizational superiority. So, what does this mean for education? The 70s saw a shift in a more tolerant direction generally. The election of the Whitlam government in 1972 is the catalyst for this, the whole It's Time campaign. Schools changed from agents of assimilation to what Fletcher called the agent of multiculturalism. So education had changed from, it was no longer about making Indigenous people into Europeans. Indigenous content was incorporated into not only the actual subjects taught at school, but also into teacher training. This is both during the actual training to be a teacher and also during service as well. So-called in-service programs were set up to improve the abilities of teachers as educators of Indigenous children. Now, this integration of a particular group into its own, or should I say the content related to a particular group into their own education may seem obvious in hindsight, of course, but this must be assessed both in light of the previous policy, protection and assimilation, and in the context of the time. This leads to the recognition of what Reynolds calls aboriginality, and it represents a broad change in education and policy generally. This aboriginality idea, we should briefly talk about that. This is the idea that Aborigines were unique and different, and this fact needed to be integrated not merely into the content taught at school, but also into teacher training and practice. Now, policy was not purely top-down. Advisory boards consisting of Aboriginal peoples were formed to advise on education policy. Seems obvious, right? A group should be involved in its own education. Everybody learning differently and all of that. But again, I would suggest context is key for assessing how big of a change this actually was. So, education policy for Indigenous people had shifted from top-down directives, as it had been from the Europeans in the past, to a form of partnership. This is progress, but is it the place of white Australia to impose our, which is the European, education system on Indigenous people, no matter how involved they are in the process? Now, the shift from top-down directives to partnership is progress, but should this education system be imposed on these people at all? In response, I offer what is very much a personal reflection. I encourage you to discuss this in the forum. If as a society we want to have Aboriginal teachers, judges, lawyers, physicians, trained professionals in other words, then yes, we must admit European education in these fields is required. But there is more to it. I don't see any reason why someone practicing law, education, medicine, anything like that, needs to surrender their cultural identity. Indeed, they should be encouraged to maintain and even augment their cultural identity and integrate it into their practice. We must admit, though, that these fields, law, medicine and so on, do require universally recognised, which in our context usually does mean European, skill sets and bodies of knowledge. For instance, Australia is not governed by tribal law. Australia is governed by European law, which is ultimately based on Roman law and so on. So, to practice law in Australia, you require knowledge of Australian law, which is ultimately grounded in European law. Perhaps the compromise here is to integrate Indigenous content into these academic fields in a similar fashion to what has been done at high school. But ultimately, what do you think? Is it the role of white society to impose the European education system on our Indigenous brothers and sisters, however involved they are in the process? I look forward to your responses. Thank you very much.